not.
So he directly told you where it was. And then did you end up finding that body?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What did you do next, if you recall?
After we found the body,
Yes.
well, of course, we released that to the medical examiner and then proceeded with the forensic interviews of the remaining grade children.
Okay. What point did you interview my client? Do you recall?
The first one,
How many times did you interview my client?
several.
Okay. Did he willingly give you statements?
Yes, sir.
When you say several, do you know exactly how many? And if you don't, it's fine.
No, sir, I do not.
Okay. But it's fair to say that throughout all of those interviews, he maintained that he had no knowledge of this dead body, correct?
Correct.
And he also maintained that he had no idea that these children were being abused.
Correct.
And while we're on the interviews of the Grays, do you know how many times, I'm going to refer to them as Mr. and Mrs. Gray, his parents, do you know how many times
Why don't we
Mr.
refer to them as Mrs. Gray and Senior and Charlie and Junior, okay? So we have two Mr. Grays.
Do you want me to just refer to him as Junior?
Refer to him as Junior, refer to his father as Senior.
Okay. Do you know how many times Senior was interviewed?
No, sir. At least twice.
At least twice, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it's fair to say that throughout both of those interviews, he maintained that his son, Junior, knew nothing of what was going on.
He never mentioned his son.
You don't remember specifically asking him about any,
He was interviewed by Roane County,
okay?
and we, the sheriff's office, I did not personally interview Mr. Grayson.
Did you have occasion to review those interviews?
Yes, sir.
And do you recall when he was specifically asked about whether or not his son knew of any of the abuse?
Yes, sir.
Do you remember him maintaining that his son knew nothing of what was going on?
No, sir. I don't recall.
But if it was there, you wouldn't
Yes, sir.
dispute that, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And those are some of the interviews that have been put into evidence today.
Yes, sir.
And why don't you want this interview to come in?
It is coming in.
We just
We
introduced
just said
it
it,
to
we
the
just
transcripts.
introduced it.
I'm sorry.
It's in the evidence. Okay.
Well, you're moving to sever based on the allegation that the co-defendants, his parents, have given statements which can incriminate and/or inculpate Mr. Gray Jr. Pursuant to Bruton. You're saying those aren't admissible, so therefore, in case it should be severed. And what I'm hearing is that Senior saying he didn't know anything about it.
This is true. There's another aspect to it, Your Honor, and it goes to, I mean, there's multiple avenues to why we're asking for it to be severed. Clearly,
Well, get me to what's relevant. I mean, I understand that you're trying to lay some background information here, but the background about how this investigation started doesn't really help the court in figuring out whether or not there is a legal basis or justification pursuant to Bruton or some other reason.
but it does go to, there are factors that go to that in the severance. The factors that lead to severance are the evidence, the amount of evidence, whether there's a conspiracy between them. I mean, there's a lot that goes to the actual factual determination of whether or not he
Those
can
are
get.
factors. The most compelling argument in this court's judgment that he has for severance is that he's not indicted in Roane County. I understand that Roane County is going to go first. Is that correct?
That is correct.
On Mr. Senior Gray and Ms. Gray, the most compelling argument he's got for severance is that he's sitting here needing a trial when it may be a year or longer before his parents can be tried because Roane County's going first.
That is true, Your Honor. But we also think one of the most compelling arguments for severance is our ability to call Mrs. Gray and Senior, in our case in chief, if a severance were granted. We wouldn't have that ability to do that if they're co-defendants.
You have the ability to do that if she looks for Fifth Amendment privilege.
Sure, But the other aspect is their statements are so thorough that we believe that if it's severed, that they would not do that. Actually, both of them have indicated to their lawyers that they would not do that. And so if this case, we're not asking that this case go first. We actually want the Rowan County to go first. It's
But
not,
he's not charged in Rowan County,
I
correct?
understand that. But we believe that part of them being found, this is where some of this factual determination comes in and how specific.
All right, get to the point.
Gray Sr. was interviewed multiple times, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in those interviews, he indicates the abuse that went on, that was perpetrated on the children, correct?
Yes,
And he indicates who perpetrated that abuse,
yes, sir.
namely him and his wife, Shirley and Sr., correct?
Yes, sir.
And then Shirley was interviewed multiple times, correct?
Yes.
Mrs. Gray. She indicates who perpetrated this abuse and killed these children, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in it, she indicates herself and her husband,
Yes, sir.
correct?
Yes, sir.
Not Junior.
Correct.
And how many other, if you don't know the exact number, it's okay. But there are multiple other interviews given of fact witnesses in this case, correct?
Yes, sir.
How many do you think there were total?
I couldn't even tell you there was someone.
Brandy Gray, correct?
I'm sorry, what was the name?
Brandy,
Yes, sir.
Hayden Gray,
Yes, sir.
Ryan Gray,
Yes, sir.
Toby Gray.
Yes, sir.
Do you remember interviewing Travis Faust?
I do.
What other interviews do you remember?
That's and a gay February, it could be the defendant's sister.
Okay. Did anyone that was ever interviewed indicate that they saw my client abuse these children?
Not saw those.
Okay. And factual allegation that's being made is it relates to tax documents,
Yes, sir.
correct?
Yes, sir.
And two of the children indicate in their interviews that he must have seen something, correct?
No, I must be, they actually said that, and I quote, Bubba knew,
Okay.
you know,
But then there's no indication with any specificity what he knew.
no, sir.
Not dates, correct?
Correct.
Not times, correct?
Correct.
Not specific instances of abuse,
No, sir.
correct? As it relates to the body being buried in halls, no one indicates that he had any part of that,
No, sir.
that he knew anything about that.
No, sir.
In fact, Mr. Gray Sr., I believe, indicates that my client was out of town when that happened, correct?
Yes, sir.
So the state is proceeding on a felony murder rule, correct?
Yes, sir.
Based upon these two allegations that he had to know, right?
Well, that and some other things that came out.
And the tax issue, correct?
Yes, sir. The text message between he and his mother recently. Well, before all this started.
Okay, saying what?
Asking, the defendant was asking his mother, should he claim the two children on his census, and does the census communicate with the IRS?
Okay, but we're talking about the tax stuff, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, there's no text messages from my client indicating that he knew any abuse, correct?
Correct.
Now, one of the other factors is an element of conspiracy or corroboration between defendants. and in this case, clearly there's 3 defendants. In all, strike that. It's fair to say there's a whole lot of evidence in this case, correct?
Yes, sir.
I mean, you guys spent a whole lot of time out there in halls and put a lot of work into this, correct?
Yes, sir.
In all that work, outside of that text message you just indicated about the tax issue, is there anything that shows that my client corroborated with his mother and father to abuse his children?
No, sir.
Is there anything that, correct, engaged in a conspiracy to try to,
That they conspired, yeah.
correct? Has there been any corroboration of a conspiracy or working together to harm these children?
No, sir.
And as it relates to evidence that would show Gray Sr. and Shirley Gray committing these acts, there's a whole host and a ton of evidence that would support that, correct?
Yes, sir.
So it's fair to say that the lion's share of evidence in this case squarely points to Gray Sr. and Shirley Gray.
Yes, sir.
Detective-wise, are there instances where Shirley Gray admits to her involvement, and I'm talking about the body in Knox County, admits to her involvement, and while admitting to her involvement, incriminates her husband, and within the same statement, attempts to or does exculpate her son, saying he didn't have anything to do with it?
Yeah, I don't recall.
You don't know if that happened, or you just...
I don't remember the entire.
Okay, let me ask a question relating to Mr. Gray Sr. Are there instances where Mr. Gray Sr. admits to his involvement with the Knox County body, Knox County child, and implicates his wife while exculpating or saying that his son knew nothing about it?
I believe so, sir.
Okay. And you want to try all 3 of them together now?
Judge, I'll have my questions and my reasons why.
Okay, go ahead.
I can have 1 second. I think that's it.
General,
All right, investigator wise, I want to talk to you a little bit about just starting out the first night, so on May 22nd, when all of this kind of broke open, okay, back in 2020. You mentioned earlier that you became aware of this from your captain, Greg Faulkner, when he called you and told you to go out to this house in Cedar Breeze, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and on that night, you mentioned earlier that this defendant and his father, Michael Anthony Gray Sr., were allowed to briefly speak, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I want to talk about that. At that point, was anyone aware of Junior's involvement in this whatsoever?
No, sir.
Okay, was the only awareness that there was something going on with Michael Anthony Gray Sr. and Shirley Gray?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And it was your indication in your testimony earlier that the reason why you all were at the Cedar Breeze house is because Michael Anthony Gray Sr. indicated that a child was buried there, right?
Yes, sir.
That child's name is Jonathan Gray.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I want to talk about that now. As I understand it, the investigation revealed that sometime between 2011 and June of 2016 is when Michael Anthony Gray Sr. and Shirley Gray lived in the basement of their son's house in Pauls on Cedar Breeze with all of their adopted children in the basement, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. During that time period, did your investigation reveal through the statements of both Toby Gray and through Ryan Gray some of the facts that had transpired, incidents, neglect, things of that nature that had occurred in that basement?
Yes, sir.
And to be clear, at that time, it wasn't just Michael Sr. and Shirley. Toby Gray lived down there in the basement. Ryan Gray, you say yes for the record, sir. Jonathan Gray,
Yes, sir.
Heather Gray,
Yes, sir.
and Brandy Gray,
Yes, sir.
right? So there were 5 kids adopted all in all that lived down there, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So when you were down, when you were investigating this, you became aware that all of those kids were living in the basement with Senior and Shirley, all while Junior and Travis Spouse lived upstairs, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now let's talk about what came out during the course of those interviews first. You mentioned earlier the interview with Toby, okay? Is it fair to say that Toby talked extensively about extreme acts of abuse and neglect that occurred in the basement of that house?
Yes, sir.
Things like being placed in a cage, being locked in a closet for a long period of time,
Yes, sir.
okay? That they were forced to use the restroom in that closet. And just to be clear, you found that closet in the basement of this man's house, correct?
Correct.
What did you find in that closet, in that basement?
The walls appeared to have equal matters spread all over it. The actual closet door, the doorknob was flipped around and there was a lock on the outside of the closet. And then up near the top, there were 2 drill holes on each side on the door frame and on the door itself to indicate that there possibly might have been a chain on that door somewhere.
Okay, so we got a backwards lock and smeared feces all over the closet.
Correct.
And this is the same house where Junior lived, right?
Yes, sir.
Was it still in that condition in 2020?
Yes, sir.
That's the condition you found it in. Okay. Now let's talk for a second about other things that Toby said. When Toby talked, when he was interviewed and he talked about the abuse and neglect that took place in that basement, did he ever tell you, or did he ever tell the examiner who spoke with him? I think he was interviewed by the Child Advocacy Center, right?
Yes, sir.
Did he talk to them about what Bubba saw?
I believe so, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Did he talk about Bubba seeing him locked up downstairs?
Yes, sir.
Did he talk about Bubba knowing what was going on down there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Was there not even a conversation about specifically Shirley Gray telling Bubba not to tell Travis Faust, his live-in boyfriend, what was going on?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So there was a lot of talk about what this defendant knew was going on downstairs, right?
Correct.
Okay. Now, let's talk about Ryan as well. Was there any statement from Ryan where he ever said that Bubba or Junior was aware of what was going on?
I think he also said that Bubba knew what was happening.
Okay. Let's talk now about Jonathan Gray, because he's the child that passed away in the Knox County house, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, earlier, just to loop back, on May 22nd, when you allowed Junior and Senior to talk, you knew about none of these things that we've just mentioned. Toby had not been interviewed.
Correct.
Okay, Ryan had not been interviewed thoroughly, right? So all of these facts weren't known about Junior's connection. And it's under those, being aware of that, or not being aware of those things, that those two were allowed to communicate, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You were there when Senior made the statement that Jonathan was buried in the backyard, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And at that time, did Senior give you the opportunity? Did he lead you to the backyard and show you where?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And in the backyard where Jonathan's body was laid to rest, are we talking about just a small little area, or was it a pretty good sized little area in the backyard?
There's a decent size area.
Okay. And in fact, there was something special about that, something different that had been placed there, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What was there?
A tree.
Okay. A tree was placed there, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Right under the area or near the area where Jonathan's body was recovered, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so in this man's backyard, you got a body found in the backyard, right?
Yes, sir.
It wasn't an inconspicuous area, was it?
No.
Okay, it was easily seen from the back of the house, areas of the house. You could even see it from the driveway, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and there was also a new tree that had been planted, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, earlier, Mr. Lanzone asked you about who was home, who wasn't home. To be clear, it's not entirely, or to be fair, it's not entirely clear whether or not Junior was in town or not in town when this occurred, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, there's differing accounts of whether or not he was in town, right?
Yes, sir.
I want to talk now about the money, okay, because that came up earlier. When you talk about tax stuff, what exactly are we talking about? What sorts of benefits was this defendant deriving from the adopted children that his parents had?
That our income credit for children, the tax credit you get for having kids.
Okay. Do you remember which children it was?
I think one of them was Toby and the other was Sophie.
Okay, Sophie Heather Gray, right? That's the child that was found deceased in Roane County, right?
Yes.
And just to be clear, this defendant had been claiming them on his taxes for how many years?
Several.
Okay. Oh, quite a while, right?
Yes, sir.
And derived a lot of money over the course of that time.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And like I said a moment ago, is it true that one of those children was the child, Sophie Heather Gray, that was found dead in Roane County?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, just to sort of wrap this up, earlier there was some discussion about what exactly the message was, or what was the nature of the message that was exchanged between them. I want to say it was in March of 2020. Do you recall?
Yeah, that sounds
Yeah.
right. Yes, sir.
It was around the time